FM 107.1.
Hi everyone, welcome to the January episode of Going Wild in the Highlands. This is episode 6, so I'm not even going to bother introducing us anymore. You all know who we are. We've got a lot to talk about as always. We're going to talk about what we're seeing in our gardens at home. We're going to talk about summer plants. We're going to talk a little bit about where to cool your heels in the Highlands and lots of other stuff. What doesn't get into our half-hour show you'll find on YouTube in our shorts section or our snippets section. But here we go. First of all, we had a little addendum that we wanted to make to the story about the mysterious killer lurking in the Highlands, the Hydrophobia. We had a little bit more that we wanted to cover in that we forgot to mention. So, Lou, would you like to tell us that bit?
Yes. Well, it's sort of fun, but it's also rather serious. You know how there are sniffer dogs out there when we're in the airport? Very often they're spaniels. Mm-hmm. Well, there are two very special spaniels called Alice and Echo who are now being trained to detect Phytophthora. You remember that fungus-like thing that is infecting all our plants around the Highlands, a soil-borne disease. They have learnt to detect Phytophthora in the soil, and that is really quite a remarkable thing. The dogs are being, hopefully used in the national parks.
Oh,
so,
right.
Yeah, these clever pups, they're part of a very successful trial to see if they can pick up the pathogen and thereby save ecosystems. So a couple of dogs can save an ecosystem. Yes, they can go to the moon, they can save an ecosystem.
Does that make them a keystone species, I wonder?
Well, a very important species. That project, it's actually being funded by lots of different very serious enterprises like the Save Our Species program.
Oh, right.
And the Animal Training Enterprise and the Botanic Gardens, the University of Sydney. And it must be happening on the Northern Beaches because the Northern Beaches Council is involved with this project.
Have they got problems with it too?
Well, I can only assume they must have,
Yeah.
Otherwise they wouldn't be putting sort of funding towards it. So it's quite a serious exercise. Yeah, I'd like to train my dog. To find, I know some find truffles. What would I like my dog to find?
I'm laughing
Diamonds?
because I know this dog, listeners, and he may take some training. He has one or two habits that I'd prefer he didn't have, but we might move on from there. So we've both been seeing various different things in our garden, and I'm really excited about what's going on in my garden. In fact, there's a great deal of copulation going on in my garden at the moment, Lou. Between spring and summer, it's all happening in my backyard.
Really?
Yes. So
What you been up to then? Al fresco.
Copulation
Oh,
all
lovely.
over. I have to be a little bit careful with my words because I had to put explicit on our last podcast because I said bum. So there you go. I've said it again. I'm going to have to put explicit on the next one. So out in my back garden, I found the tiniest weeny little pair of beetles. They looked like ladybirds, very, very similar to ladybirds with that beautiful convex shape to them. And they were copulating on my eucalyptus. Having done a bit of research, I've established that they're Eucalyptus variegated leaf beetles. They are very cute, but having, as I've said, done some research, I've learned that
They eat leaves.
they eat eucalyptus leaves, and they particularly like eucs that are less than 3 years old, which categorises all of mine. I put them in only a few years ago.
Lovely, tender, young leaves.
That's right. And they
Yum.
can go through something like 8 life cycles in the course of a year. So they are a potential problem, pretty as they might be. So I've been checking my eucs on a daily basis and picking off the leaves that have got eggs or larvae on them and hoping for the best. But at the moment, I think they're in manageable numbers and I've just got to keep an eye on them, but very cute.
I think I've seen them. In fact, my neighbour asked me to look at them and I went, because we were looking for Christmas beetles, remember? And they're
yes.
metallic, aren't they? They're really
Oh,
bright.
these ones are, mine are kind of orange and yellow and red spots all over them. And
Yeah.
the male and the female have different colorations, but
No blue
pretty-
one? No blue?
no.
We had ones with blue on them and red spots, and they were metallic, and I looked them up. They were called jewel beetles.
Oh, yes, I've got them as well.
Oh, you've got... Tell me something you haven't got in your garden. And she was worried they were harmful, and I
No.
looked them up. They're not great, but they don't last for long. And I didn't know what to say because I didn't want her to get out the spray can, you know.
No. Look, I'm going to go off piste here and talk about something else, and that is that I've got a concern that we've become so accustomed to having our houses absolutely spick and span and tidy and nothing messy in there, and now we've extended that preference into our gardens, and people don't want creepy crawlies and insects in their gardens. They want the whole thing to be meticulously curated, and that's just not ideal for the environment. I read a little comment somewhere recently that said, if you haven't got insects in your garden, you are not contributing to the ecosystem. And,
Yes.
you know, I think that that's so valid. So even though my little guys are maybe not ideal to have, I'm going to do my best to manage them just by checking the leaves regularly and keeping their numbers down until my gums get beyond that vulnerable period.
Well, then think we should be talking about those soldier beetles. that you
Sure,
see.
let's go over to
Yes, because
plague
I've got
soldier
some very
beetles.
good news about them.
Okay.
Because they can be a bit gross when they're in such huge numbers.
They are a
sometimes.
bit intimidating. I've been seeing posts in social media of people panicking because they're getting hundreds of them.
all swarming on leaves
That's
and
right.
trunks.
That's
And
right.
yeah, and so, it can be a bit scary, but they're not scary. They don't bite. They don't squirt stuff on you, although they can apparently... We should describe them.
I was thinking that.
Yeah, they're black and yellow, but they're
Yes.
not really black. Those wings are actually, if you look closely, they're sort of like a dark bottle green, aren't
Yes,
they?
or oliveygreen. They're about 15 millimetres long, and they
Yes.
have long, narrow wings that I would call olivey green, and they've got a yellow, soft body underneath, and they've got a yellow tail that pokes out.
And a
at the
black
back,
head.
and a black head, and sort of a yellow collar. And I think of them, speaking of copulation, I think of these guys as the bonobos of the insect world. They really like orgies. They're into it. In fact, I read a research study that said they checked out a colony of plague soldier beetles, and in that colony, 92% were copulating.
Yes, they go to flowers, don't they? You see them
Yes.
all over flowers, and they do seem to be sort of all climbing on top of one another. And so
yes, that's one way to put it.
it's a sort of flower party for adults only, isn't it? Really, I think that they're actually very good pollinators.
Oh, right.
And they drink nectar.
Nectar.
I don't know if they get drunk on that nectar and then they go for the swarmy thing. But whatever it is, it's something you can just look at. You don't have to freak out, although you might freak out because, of course, it's all moving. But they're actually quite good news. And I heard a very interesting thing talking about how helpful insects can be. The CSIRO has found that they produce a sort of waxy exudate, a little sort of like fluid, and they protect their eggs with this fluid, and it has antimicrobial qualities. So it's keeping disease out of their eggs, and they've managed to synthesize those properties in the laboratory, and they're thinking about it as a possible way of saving lives or developing antibiotics or anti-cancer drugs.
Yeah, it's fantastic, isn't it?
So the insects, particularly insects and plants, are basically where we go. It's like our larder for everything that we need to keep us healthy, and we need to keep them healthy.
Yes, yes.
So I like them.
Yep, and they'll only stay there a few days. They will not eat the plant out of house and home because they're too busy
Copulating.
The one concern that sometimes people have is that the weight of them on a branch or a twig might break that part of the plant, but that's really the only concern. They'll only hang around for a few days and then they'll disappear.
Harmless.
And they're paying
Absolutely
you a
harmless.
compliment. They're saying that your garden is a welcoming place for them to have an orgy. Can
Yeah.
I go back to
yes.
what else is happening in my garden?
Yes, do.
I found in my watering can 2 Peron's tree frogs.
Oh, how cute.
They're, really lovely. So I've gone off and done more research. You'll remember last time I had a screaming tree frog. This time I've got 2 Peron's tree frogs. These are a larger tree frog. They're about 7 centimetres from snout to, what did we...
Vent.
That's right. And I tipped the 2 of them out from the watering can because I needed it and put them in one of the bird baths. And immediately I noticed that one of them went straight under the water and just sat there under the water looking at me. And the other one popped straight out onto the side on a rock, also looking at me. I think they were annoyed that I'd interrupted them when I did. But it really brought home to me the fact that these guys are amphibians. Frogs are Australia's only amphibians. And so, as you know, that means that they can breathe both underwater and in plain air, so to speak. And there I was confronted with the image of one way under the water, just happily breathing away down there, and a second one out of the water. Lou's frowning at me because I've said breathing. Frogs have 3 different ways of exchanging oxygen and carbon dioxide. One of them, which they use when they're underwater, is that they can literally breathe through their skin. And so you've heard us talk about this before. They're very vulnerable to anything that's in the water that may pass across that barrier. But they also have lungs, although they don't have ribs to open and close their lungs. And they also can breathe through the lining of their mouth. So they've got options, unlike us, for how they choose to breathe. And the Peron's tree frog apparently doesn't come down from the tree at all, except when it's wishing to copulate and put its eggs into a puddle or something down on the ground. And that struck me too, that we haven't mentioned when we've talked about frogs that their spawn is kind of foamy, jelly, bubbly to look at. And sometimes you'll see that on puddles and things. It's really quite interesting. That's their eggs waiting to grow a little bit and turn into taddies.
Sometimes I look in my pond and I see a little flotilla of bubbles. Mm-hmm. And I look very closely to see if indeed they are a flotilla of bubbles or in fact they're frogs. Spawn.
Oh, yeah. And my one final fact about frogs is that frogs don't have necks, or they don't have a spinal neck, so they can't turn their head, which is why every time you see an image of a frog, they look so cute. They are never looking sideways. They can't turn their neck at all.
I was told they look cute because they got big eyes.
Yes.
And people used to say when we were looking at what to put on a front cover in nature magazines, put a frog because it's like putting Princess Di on the front. Yeah.
That actually reminds me of one more frog fact, that they swallow by dipping their eyes down into the roof of their mouth and pushing the food down their throat with their eyes. Just imagine that.
Well, let's get in one thing that I found in my garden.
Mm-hmm.
I was just poddling away and I heard the noisy miners going off. Now, I am very alert to the noisy miners because they are birds that always indicate when something is upsetting them. when opossums come out of a tree, when a hawk is going overhead. You can hear them. They all start squealing and they all start to fly in together. So I went and had a look to see what all the fuss was about, and there was an echidna in my garden.
Oh, congratulations.
And he was just waddling along, snuffling along, he was really happy, except that the noisy miners are a pain, I suppose, for him. But he's got huge spines.
So why do they object to an echidna? He's no
They
threat.
object to everything, don't they? They're just objectionable in that
I know
respect.
the odd person like
They
that.
don't like anything invading their territory.
At
Anyhow, I
all.
was thrilled to see him. I don't know if it was a
Yes,
him.
that's great.
I wouldn't even know how to sex
No,
an echidna.
We haven't. No, I think in fact they're quite hard to sex. I remember from when we talked about that in the past. Not
Yes,
sure
I
on that
have
one.
been. Well, I imagine you'd have to turn him over for starters.
Yes. Let's leave him to his own devices or hers. So, Lou, you have got a bit of an obsession at the moment about watering plants. You've got some advice for
Well,
us.
I'm going away in a few days, and I am in a bit of a tiz because I have all sorts of plants. I have plants in containers, I have it in tube stock, I have a lot of young plants, and I have a lot of tender plants, and I'm concerned that everything should be kept watered because the summers can be so hot now. And so I thought I would talk a little bit about how to water. I think everyone thinks it's blooming obvious, but actually it's not quite that straightforward. First of all, when to water. Early morning is definitely best. If you can't do it in the early morning, do it late at night. But don't do it when the sun is bearing down on your plants because you will singe the leaves. The water will evaporate too fast. So early morning is best. And also try not to water when it's windy because, again, it evaporates really quickly. Don't water on top of the plant, like on the leaves and the flowers. Water at the root. That's where the water needs to be. There is a whole system there that starts with the roots, and if you don't get it into the roots, no good watering the leaves alone. Hose attachments. I had a lot of fun playing with all the different flows in mine. Some of them are quite useless. Some of them are really good. So just be careful. Get one that has many different kind of things. I have one that does misting, which I use for my tube stock. You don't want to put, a great flush of water down into a tiny little pot with barely
Knock over your
developed
little-
roots.
Yeah.
So that's really useful. I would suggest that when you water, at least for mature plants, go long and hard and deep and not often.
Right. So how often is not often?
Well, it depends on the plant, just to be awkward.
dear.
If you've got native plants, of course, one of their great features is that they don't require nearly as much water as most exotic plants. When they're really, really mature, I don't water them at all. They seem to be able to make it through a hot summer. So if I saw wilting, I might, but otherwise I wouldn't worry about it. If you've got plants in containers, they dry out really fast. You may have to water them every day if it's a sort of season of continuous hot days. And young plants too. Remember, they've only got tiny roots. They've got to be watered frequently. So one of the problems for me is when I go on holidays, how do I keep my young plants watered? So you can fill up saucers and put the pots in the saucers. I have trays. Actually, I use cat litter. And I put all my plants in there, and then I put water into the trays. And that is good. There's only one problem there. You go on holiday, you think it's going to be steaming hot, and actually it pours with rain, and then they drown. So what you can do is take those trays, fill them up to a certain point, have holes in the side so that it drains out.
If it goes beyond a certain
If it
height.
goes beyond a certain point. And then if you're worried about how much to water, put your finger into the soil. So if you just put your finger in, 25 mil or something like that, you will be able to tell whether there is some moisture there or not. And if there isn't, you need to water it. And there are some plants in your veggie patch which you really need to water without watering the leaves. So really try and get down there. So for cucumbers and zucchinis and tomatoes and even strawberries, they can get a fungal disease on their leaves and it can affect the fruit. So try to water under the leaves as much as you're able. Drip irrigation, of course, solves this problem, but I frankly have got tied up in knots with my irrigation system. I don't plant in lines, not even in the veggie gardens. So those are some of the things you can do. And I did disappear down a rabbit hole when I was actually reading about watering and how different and remarkable, really, a plant is in its anatomy from, say, an animal. And they are just as complex, They have all this extraordinary push and pull system to pull the water from the soil into the rootlets, up the roots, up into these long pipes that go all the way up the stems of the plants. The pipes are called xylems, and there's all sorts of complex pressures, low and high pressures and osmotic pressures and clever things going on that pull this water up into the leaves, where, of course, they basically are used in what we call transpiration and also in photosynthesis. And what is also remarkable is how they stop in drought and they can't pull the water up. They actually have a device in the leaves that allows them to close down the whole system. They have millions of pores in the leaves. And these pores are usually open, and they're usually there for gas exchange so that CO2 could come out of the air and mix up with water and make photosynthesis. But if things are really dire and the water simply cannot pump up because it is just too hot, these pores will close down. And so there is a trade-off going on, because once they've closed down, which means they can't lose water to the atmosphere, then the carbon dioxide cannot get in. So photosynthesis cannot happen. Right. So there is this trade-off all the time going on between getting enough water in and getting enough carbon dioxide in. And so that's the rabbit hole I fell down.
Well, that takes me to, we talked about mistletoe last time, and we talked about the fact that those pores, the stoma, never close in mistletoe. And it actually makes the mistletoe very, very vulnerable to dry weather. It's in drought, it's one of the very first things to go.
They drop?
They can't close their stoma. So mistletoe will die during drought and particularly during fire because it just won't tolerate heat.
Right.
So that fits in with your story about the dry. It makes sense.
Can I just say there's a phobia that plants have. It's called hydrophobia.
Oh, yes.
Hydrophobia is when basically the soil cannot take the water, and so it cannot get into the root system.
Right.
So what it is actually a kind of waxy coating, and you may have seen it when it's very hot and you haven't watered and you see the water just running straight off. It's not going in, just running away. And so that is a really tricky thing that happens quite a lot in hot, dry climates. And it's a problem because you think you're watering, but you're not. It's just running
filling
off.
the gutters.
It's going nowhere. So there are a few things you can do. You can, to start with, I very often just put a splash in just to see if it goes in. And then I'll go and do some other watering, and then I'll come back to see if it's soaked in, and then I'll give it a bit more, and then go away, and then a bit more, and a bit more, and then and eventually you can soak it in. Another thing you can do is rough up the surface because it's really forming a kind of crust. Or you can add mulch, long as you don't put it near the stem, of course, because we know that causes fungus root problems. So the mulch will slow down the water absorption into the soil a little bit. But it is a really serious problem. And a lot of people use wetting agents because of this. There are two sorts. There's actually the crystals which blow up into great big bubbles, right, with water. And they retain water for a long time, so close to the roots when you've planted it, and they can release the water and the roots can get it. There is also a liquid that you can add when you're watering with your watering can or whatever.
Oh, right.
But there is anecdotal evidence, but the Royal Botanic Gardens in Sydney thinks that it's possible that these wetting agents might be interrupting the mycorrhizal fungal process that every plant needs. So this is quite distressing because we don't know at this stage whether this is the case or not, but there is some evidence and it's come from a pretty reliable source.
Like everything, it's complex.
It's complex, yeah. Are there any things happening in January?
There aren't very many official things happening in January, but we've got a few suggestions for anytime you've got a little bit of downtime. The first one is the BirdLife summer surveys. They go through December and January. You can do those anytime during that period. Another inside activity is Digivol. Digivol is a platform that was developed by the Australian Museum in collaboration with the Atlas of Living Australia. And it's an online project where you can help museums and data collectors throughout the world to identify things that they're recording on cameras, or museums who want to get their records digitised. There's just all kinds of stuff over there. So, for example, the Glossies in the Mist Feed the Birds project has lots of images from wildlife cameras that need to be gone through by people looking at them and identifying who is that, checking out the nest box, all kinds of stuff to look at over there. It's really quite interesting and you can make major contributions. And it's not just being used by Australian platforms, it's being used by museums around the world. So you never know what you might see on there. Check it out. There's lots of online training if you go to the Digivol platform, so don't think that you need to know what Australian mammals or something you need to be able to recognise, because you'll get all the training in the world on the platform.
How do you spell it?
It's Digivol, Digivol. And then another thing you can do is check out our channel on YouTube. We've got more and more short snippets going up over there. There's all kinds of stuff. So have a look over there and see what things you might learn about on a relaxing afternoon. And just one more message. I've been asked by the Feed the Birds project. Feed the Birds project is a fabulous project which works at propagating and planting feed trees for the glossy black-cockatoos, which are an endangered species in our area. And they're going to have a final giveaway in March, and they're asking people to think about whether they want some glossy black-cockatoo feed trees. If you're interested in having some free, I think, glossy black-cockatoo feed trees, you can contact Beth Mott, that's M for Mary, O-T-T, at environment.newsouthwales.gov.au. I'll put that link in the show notes if you didn't catch it. So that's the end of things happening in January, and I think it's the end of our show for this month, Lou.
I think it must be. Yes, we seem to have gone through a lot. But then there's always so much happening.
Yeah, by next month we'll have a whole lot more to talk about.
Oh, there'll be plenty going on. And now that we're basically all out of our offices and looking around us, I think we'll have lots of reports. Please send in your reports too. If you have things that are special that you see and you want to know more, we're very happy to try and help you out.
Yeah, we'd love to hear about that. So you can find us on Highland FM at 8 p.m. on Monday nights, or anytime on their website under podcasts. You'll also find us wherever you get your podcasts. And as I mentioned, we're on YouTube. We have our audio over there. We have all kinds of snippets, and we usually have some great photos that go along with our audio. We've got a group of photographers who are helping us out with that, and some of the stuff they're providing is really terrific. You'll find us on Facebook. You'll find us on Instagram. Thank you once again to Highland FM for sponsoring us, and particularly to Adam Stokeld, Warren Barnett, Harrison East, and Louise Docker, and all our contributing photographers, Linda, Nigel, Mustafa, Anna, Jenny and Graham, and I hope I haven't left anyone else out. Thanks everyone. See you in February. Bye now.